All right, welcome everybody. Patrick, how are you today?
Good. Can everybody hear me first of all?
I can hear you
great.
clear. So I know we're gonna go on time here in order to make sure that we get things done for the top of the hour. Because Pat, you've got a fun meeting coming up, the kind of thing that most of the people on the call don't get to say. You've got a meeting with all the chief pilots at Gulfstream.
That's correct.
So
and guess what we're going to talk
about? Because I'm guessing your documentation day is going to be part of the conversation that's in there. And you get to do some really, really cool things. I think at one point you sent me a picture where you're in the cockpit flying along over top of Lake Huron. And I saw a tablet there and it had the documentation right on it. So it's just a really cool kind of an environment. But do you want to give a quick background, who you are, what you do?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pat Porter. I'm a pilot with Gulfstream Aerospace. I do production test flying, which means when airplanes get built and they roll out of the factory, we take them on their first flights and we run them through a series of detailed flight tests in order to get the airplane what they call a certificate of airworthiness. And then we induct them into paint and completions to get the interiors put in. And then we do a whole nother series of flight tests on the completed airplanes to make sure that they are perfect before we deliver them to our customers. In addition, I took on the responsibility about 2 years ago now to stand up and lead a team within flight operations. We essentially moved to go from sort of a horizontally integrated structure where the pilots were responsible for content creation along with engineering, but the technical writing and the publishing and the distribution or release and distribution was handled by another group. That was now all vertically integrated in my group. And in order to sort of move the ball down the field in terms of objectives for now and in the future, one of the key enablers was moving to some new technology for how we did our content authoring and publishing, and the choice for that was DITA.
And if people want to reach out and contact you, I've put up a QR code here. If anybody wants to scan that, if you go back afterwards, that'll give you a chance to jump in and see what's there. On my side, I have been involved in DITA for quite a while. I have a company called Publishing Smarter. We do a lot of work around content strategy. We do a lot of work on template setup, configuration, conversion. And it's been a really interesting project between the two of us in order to work our way through and get all of this going. In regards to the key takeaways that we have for today, what I want to do is make sure that we talk about a couple of core things. One is your content has to be delivered to multiple outputs. It goes to all kinds of different audiences, and you've got a lot of different documentation sets. And what I personally find really interesting about this is that it pulls together a lot of the ideals of what DITA can be or what DITA should be in regards to the world at large when you turn around and you hand out materials. So if we look at it from sort of that, and you literally get the view from 30,000 feet, which is awesome. But if we look at that and we say, bigger picture, what is it that one source to many output means in your kind of an environment? And we can address each of these in a little more detail, but we're going to be talking about the fact that you have to deliver PDF, you have to deliver print, you have to deliver digital. This content is used inside the cockpit. You have writers, you have engineers, you have different pilots, you have different regulatory requirements to meet, and you've got different types of manuals that have to be put together. So I know the plan is to create content for all of these different types of outputs, print and PDF and digital in the cockpit. That gets to be challenging. It's not just a reformat. You're also having to repurpose. Can you walk us through a little bit of each of these different outputs? What is it that makes it unique? What are the things that you need to be able to do? And I'll start with the idea of print.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I think I need to break it down into the today and the future. So I think at the tail end of the previous session, I heard some commentary about scraping away with your fingertips, the last vestiges of attachment to desktop publishing and paper, and that's the environment that we live in. So at the regulatory level, there is still a requirement to put a paper flight manual inside of every airplane. And our airplane flight manuals for our newest airplanes are about 2,000 pages, and they fill up about 2 binders worth of 8.5 by 5.5 paper. And typically they just sit in a cupboard or in a hole in the floor of the flight deck, and nobody ever touches them. But they're required to be there by regulation. The way we surface our content now on the flight deck is essentially through a PDF that is really just a digital representation of the printed artifact, but we take advantage of the technology that's available in publishing to make it as interactive as we can. And you know very well what it takes to do that. With navigation tools that are formatted and stylistic and have some human factors considerations in terms of their color and their sizing and their spacing, so that things are easily accessible visually and in a tactile manner to reduce errors as you navigate through the flight manual content to get to where you want to be. But we're not stopping there. So that's kind of the where are we today, but where are we going in the future? And so what Bernard's showing you on the screen right there is the PDF representation that we have in our iPad application that we call Planebook, which again, this is a PDF, but it has more interactive features than what you see in the printed version, but it all comes from the same source. And what we've done to create this output is basically just the application of different templates that either includes or excludes or reformats the certain features and that sort of thing. But in the future, we're looking at going to an all like XML driven iPad-based application that would obviously be derived from the source DITA XML. And then I think a little bit later, we're going to talk about, how can we leverage our DITA-based content to actually get that same content on the avionics in the cockpit, so that flight crews don't have to refer to a document anymore. It's right there, interactive with their displays and controls, as if it's another piece of the airplane's avionics.
That's where it gets to be really cool. I remember when you took us on a tour and we sat inside the airplane, how impressive it was to sit in the back of the plane in the leather couch with the beautiful tables and the incredible luxurious feel of what was there. And then when we went into the cockpit, it just felt like stepping into the future. The illustration here is something off of the Gulfstream website. Some of the things that caught my attention, it's award-winning, which just in itself, the touchscreen avionics, that you've got this phase of flight intelligence built into it. There's already all kinds of technological jumps that are being made, but you actually get to use this. You sit inside that cockpit, you're flying along, you've got everything in front of you. What's that experience, and where is it that you plan to go next with regards to what we're seeing here?
Well, the interesting thing about the Symmetry flight deck and not just the flight deck, but the underlying system architecture and avionics architecture is, a continued drive towards simplification and automation. Let the systems do more of the mundane tasks and let the pilots kind of move up to sort of a higher plane of thinking, where they become systems managers and managing the environment rather than focusing on button pushes and things like that, and then have the system give you the information that you need and that you want at the right times. That's that phase of flight concept that you mentioned. So it makes for a very enjoyable flying experience, and again, opens up your processing power in your brain to deal with situations in the environment, rather than consuming that bandwidth with manipulation of aircraft switches and functions and things like that. But as I said, one of the things that we're trying to do with our XML content is, if you look at those displays, you can see, for example, the second large display from the left that has the black and white, the runway crossing there. Just to the right of that, you see like a gray panel that's about 1/3 the size of that screen. Those are actually divided up into two halves. We call those the 1/6 displays because they take up 1/6 of the display. So on those 1/6 displays, for example, right now you can call up checklists for various functions. And the way it works right now is there's a separate tool that we use to manually enter our procedural content into that tool to generate the database that goes on the airplane. And what we're trying to do with our DITA content is to automate that process and basically take that procedural content straight from our content repository and run a transformation on it, because it has to be converted to an XML schema that complies with the avionics vendors' requirements. But then basically from there, you get an aircraft loadable database that goes right into the airplane. So the intent is to try to eliminate the need or eliminate the potential for human error in transcribing content from the content management system into the database tool, and just have that automated where you know that the content that you put into your content management system is the content that made it to the flight deck. And
there's an interesting thing that was mentioned in the chat. Somebody said, "My sympathies. I'm also in an industry that still requires paper copy." Where would you differentiate that digital versus print, and how much better is this digital experience for you?
Where it really comes into play, for example, the nice thing about these modern airplanes, and some people might roll their eyeballs thinking about what just happened with the 777 out of Denver, but in general, these airplanes are extremely reliable, right? So typically, you're not going to have to deal with complex and compound emergencies. So the training scenario, you get ample opportunity to interact with your content. And if you think about the paper world and having to find things by going to a tab and then flipping through pages and then scanning it visually, and it's very, very time consuming when what you need to be able to do is find your content quickly, get to the procedure, take the steps you need to take, get the airplane to a stable configuration, figure out your game plan. Where am I going to go? Do I need to land? Those kind of things. What are my configuration concerns? With whatever I'm dealing with. And so even though in the iPad version it's a PDF, the fact that through the tools that DITA and our publishing processes and templates give us, we can add all of that rich functionality to very, very quickly navigate to the procedures that we need, limitations, considerations, et cetera, et cetera. And that in and of itself reduces the workload and reduces the stress level when you find yourself in an abnormal or emergency situation. I literally pop open a book, I click on the tab I want. I'm trying to get to the point where I'm 3 clicks away from anything I need. I don't know if I'll ever get there, at least with the current way we have the books structured. But for any kind of emergency or abnormal procedure, I'm usually about, I think, 4 clicks away from the content that I need, and they're very straightforward clicks. I know what I need to click on to get where I need to go, and I'm not flipping through hundreds and hundreds of pages to find what I need. And so where we're trying to go in the future with that is to, again, eliminate the middleman of having a PDF, because in my mind a PDF is really like you're tying an anchor still to the paper world, right? A PDF, at least in the way that we publish them, is really just a digital manifestation of a paper product. Whereas if we go to some sort of native iOS or Android-based system that's all HTML or XML driven, and we just take one step out of the process, and we can design the user interface however we want.
In the context of what we were seeing and talking about, the paper copy and the iPad, when you're in the cockpit, they are largely a backup. You've got your your navigational tools and your instructional information pretty much right in front of you. You're flying along and it's a nice, safe, steady flight. You're in autopilot. You could always reference the iPad. You could work with it in that environment, jump back and forth. Is that generally the case? The iPad and the paper is a backup and something that you could use when you're not in the cockpit or for studying or for review?
Well, right now, our normal procedures are available on the avionics, and again, we're trying to get to the point where we can transfer that content from our content management system to the database tool to generate the database. But for right now, all of our abnormal and emergency procedures, we still need to reference the iPad, but we're looking to evolve that in the future.
And then you've got your various audience that are actually either creating or consuming this information. And I sort of broke it into two. The people who work with it sort of day in, day out, and then more of the regulatory side. But if we take a look first from the perspective of the writers are working inside an AEM environment, they've got that visual interface, they're using the maps, they're creating the topic-based materials. The reviews might be done in AEM, maybe in a PDF. The pilots are inside a sim at given times. They're in a training room, or they're in the cockpit actually working with it. In these types of environments, it must be nice not to have to slug around an extra 30 or 40 pounds of paperwork because you've got your iPad. But aside from that, what do you think about in regards to the audience and how you deliver the information for their experience, from a writer to a reviewer to a pilot or an engineer?
Well, I'll start with the writers. One of my writers who writes the manual that you see in the lower right-hand corner, all of his content was in the older content management system that they were using before. And since probably the December timeframe, he works all of the G7 manuals and the G8 manual. And so he's been all DITA since December, and he's been my pathfinder a little bit because, as you know, we've had a lot more evolution of not only the content but the publishing processes since then. He really enjoys it. He's adapted to it. He's learned it. He likes being in one system, doing things one way, and that was also a big motivator for this project of implementing one content management system with a standardized DITA-based XML structure. Is have all of the writers trained on one system. They all know how to do the same kinds of tasks. We're publishing to a common set of outputs. You know, over the years, as technology has changed, we might have some documents that are written in Word, some are written in our older content management system with one type of SGML markup. We have other content in that same content management system that was written to an S1000D specification implementation, and so there's a real efficiency gain to be had by transforming all of that to DITA in one content management system and one structure and one publishing process and one set of outputs. I think the key takeaway there is we want to be responsive. So if we have to make fact of life changes, we want to be able to go into our system, make the change, publish the output, get it reviewed, and get it released. You know, and our goal is to be able to do that same day or next day. Now, same day is a hope because there's always, you know, review processes required by the regulatory agencies and things like that. And there's QA that has to go in, but that's our goal is to be able to publish a change within 24 hours, which is kind of unheard of to date. So that's the writer piece of it. And I think the other thing the writers appreciate is they have total control over the publishing and now even the release process. So it's all sort of self-contained within my group. You don't have to ask anybody permission to, hey, can I get this manual printed, or hey, can I get it released? They just work on doing it. As far as the pilots and our organization designation authority, which is that ODA you mentioned, the ODA for people that don't know, they're basically Gulfstream employees that at certain times they have a designation from the FAA to kind of act on their behalf to basically work the compliance piece of things. And then there's the FAA. So we have objectives. We're still kind of crawling, with this new system. But the intent is to involve all of them in like review and approval workflow processes so that we can do everything self-contained within our content management system. And, we're still working on proving out those processes internally.
And when it comes to the FAA and EASA, and we did a session yesterday with the FAA, but those regulatory agencies and people in North America have likely heard FAA, people in Europe have likely heard of EASA at some point in time. There's source content you have that has to have unique information for each of them. How does DITA come into play in that?
Good question. So, once upon a time, we had unique manuals for an FAA audience, and we had unique manuals for so EASA is the European Aviation Safety Administration. It's the European equivalent of the FAA. But those documents were written in Microsoft Word, and my understanding is they got too difficult to maintain in that type of authoring environment. So what ended up happening is we would create an FAA version of the manual, and then we would create a supplement which contained only the differences between the FAA manual and the EASA content, just based on some differences in regulations or even differences in interpretations of the regulations. The EASA regulators might require some slight differences in procedures or limitations and that sort of thing. And so where I'm trying to get to with DITA is basically have an attribute tagging system where I can tag content by the audience, which in this case, we're using that attribute for the regulatory agency. So it might be EASA, it might be FAA, it might be, the Brazilians, the Israelis, the Russians, whoever has a certification role for our products in their native countries. And then also be able to tag by aircraft type. Like the G7 family of aircraft, for example, consists of the G500 and the G600 aircraft. Most of their content might be common. There might be some differences, but the intent is to be able to tag unique content by the type of airplane. And I think we have, a couple of other types of tagging, like the type of manual. So the intent is, to the extent possible and practical, is have one set of source content that has differences tagged, and then you basically sort that out at publishing time to produce a document for that particular audience.
I'm sort of laughing a little bit because the same as yesterday, the idea of all of these different regulatory agencies and how they interpret things. The comment with Bruce yesterday from the FAA was the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. And it sounds like you have to choose from all of the above, and you have to comply with all of the above, which must just make the documentation a really interesting challenge. I would phrase it as interesting. Sound fair?
Yeah. If you look at Part 25 of Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, literally everything that we do on this airplane has to be documented as showing compliance towards all of those regulations, and then the detailed, interpretations and guidance that flows from that. So I think the paperwork required to certify an airplane is probably a couple of stacks of paper from here to the ceiling. So
content that you're doing in a lot of cases is really, truly reusable. So you're not just doing multiple formats by going to print and PDF and digital and multiple audiences by having things for the pilots and for the engineers and the writers and the reviewers. And you're also taking a chunk of source information and you're using it in a flight manual, an operating manual, you're putting it into supplements. So you're doing all of the above, as opposed to some organizations that might go in and say, yeah, you know what, we have a user guide and an administrator guide, and we'll have some content that's common and separate. And somebody else says, hey, you know what, we do some information that's going to be applicable to the given platform or product or audience. You have to hit all three. And in the case of things like your AFMs or your AOMs, your supplements, what does the manual type mean for the requirement from DITA, and how are you getting DITA to do what you need in these cases?
Well, essentially, it gets back to that tagging structure that I mentioned, where I think we're using, what are we using, platform these days? I'll tell the audience, I've had to stretch Bernard's fluency with DITA, I think to the limits. because, I'll tell him, hey, we need to be able to do this. And he'd go, well, there is a DITA element for that, and we could use this attribute, but that's not really kind of what the spec requires. And oftentimes he'll find something, kind of digress here for a second, but I had a situation a couple of weeks ago where we write these supplemental manuals, and what I discovered was, hey, we might write a piece of content in a supplement that says, hey, change paragraph 4F of this procedure to whatever the change is. And I'm like, well, I can't do that with an ordered list because that just starts at number one. And could I do a bulleted list with a special output class put on it? And then you could, update the EDD with putting no bullet on it or whatever. And he goes, hey, we could use a simple list for that. Oh, okay, awesome. So he's expanding my knowledge. If anybody's listening that controls the DITA spec, could you please enable the ability to do nested simple lists? Please, please, please. Yeah, like I've said, but I've stretched Bernard's fluency of DITA by telling him, hey, here's the functionality or the behavior that I need to see in the rendered, visual world. And he's had to come up with some very interesting and creative solutions to do that. And I appreciate it because once he does, it's always awesome.
It's so cool.
And sometimes
it really is.
Okay, this is good.
I was going to say I'm like sitting on the edge of my seat going, it's so cool when we sit there and we click the button and say go, and you take the AEM content and you flatten that map and you run it through FrameMaker, and it just hits all of the pages and it does all kinds of things. And when it hits one of those bugs, it's just soul searing to look at it and go, that didn't work. All right. And then go back and troubleshoot and figure out what it is. And then to get a message from you that says, hey, I just ran it. This thing looks perfect. I'm submitting. It just totally, and I don't know why it usually happens on a Friday, but on a Friday, a text message from you that says something like that means crack open a beer and enjoy the weekend.
So poor Bernard, he and his team will work many, many days, very long hours to try to either implement something or correct something, because it's one of those situations with software. We've continued to expand the envelope with what we've been doing over the past year. Every time we do that, there's always the potential to break something, right? And we've had some situations with that. And so they'll work very, very hard. They'll send me some updated scripts or templates, and I'll run a publish, and I'll send them a bunch of screenshots of the stuff that's still not working. And it's like, I'm sure it's like the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows, and then they'll come back the next day and they'll go, oh, we found this, and they'll fix it and whatever. And like, for example, my tech writer that's doing the G7 manuals, he just got the latest drop of templates and scripts, and he ran a manual end to end, and it was absolutely discrepancy free. It was perfect. He didn't have to do anything because for a little while there were some manual writer things he had to do with maybe running some scripts or running some utilities manually and scanning through the content and looking for random line breaks due to some weird behavior that's now been fixed. And so today, literally, he just hit convert, did a map to plain book, and sat back, got a cup of coffee, came back, and the manual published, and he saved it as a PDF, and he paged through it. And there was not one discrepancy at all. So he's a very happy camper right now.
That's really cool. And a couple of questions in the chat window. I'll read them in reverse order. Did you look at Spec 2300 when you were evaluating schemas?
Can someone tell me what Spec 2300 is? Is that the replacement for?
Going to be something
it's one of the iSpec standards.
That's a great question because our older manuals, I'll say G6 and prior, that were in the older content management system were supposedly written to quote unquote an iSpec standard compared to S1000D. No offense to any S1000D devotees in the audience. I found the S1000D specification had way too much XML overhead for what we were trying to do with our flight manuals. And so I opted to move away from S1000D. And I actually liked, Bernard, you've probably looked at some of our old content. I liked the older, quote unquote ATA. It was actually in SGML, the older documents. But I liked that structure. I thought it was simpler and it was more human friendly to read. But the choice of content management system drove a DITA solution. And then when I studied the difference is what I found was I really didn't need all of the aviation specific kind of markup. It's not a maintenance manual. And I found that flight manual is really, it's not much different than a traditional document. It's got paragraphs, it's got sections, it's got bulleted lists, it's got ordered lists, and there's a little bit of metadata here and there to either drive certain publishing behaviors or to put some regulatory required information, in the header and the footer and things like that. But the other consideration too is we wanted an XML structure that would work for all of our other documents. We just converted our flight operations manual to DITA, and my boss wants to convert as much of our documentation in flight ops as we can towards DITA. So I think what we concluded was we like kind of having the, maybe not generic is the right term for it, but like to me it makes sense. Oh, you want a paragraph here? Great, there's a paragraph. We've had to do a lot of things with output classes where maybe if you had a more ATA iSpec informing XML structure, you wouldn't have to do that to drive certain behaviors. But yeah, we looked at that hard and ultimately landed on DITA. And again, a big part of it was because the content management system that we chose, that is the XML implementation that's used.
And one of the other questions that came up, and it sort of brings us back to the idea of multiple consumers of the information, multiple document sets. How do you ensure that you are getting the correctly sort of permissioned material and that it's going to the right people and the right place and as close to real time as possible on that?
Sure, you want the answer to that? I hate to say it, but it's human. It's human QA. Yeah. I might have mentioned this last year and talked about this, but I racked my brains and had a lot of conversations with folks like you and some other industry experts about how do we QA our content, meaning when we converted it from the old system to the new system, how do I know that I got out of the old system what I needed to get into the new system, and that every step was correctly numbered, every word was there. What I found interestingly was during the initial stages of the conversion during the implementation project, we never lost any content. There was never, the stuff between the carets never ever got lost. It was always all there. What we ended up losing as we were kind of learning our way through how to do the conversion scripting was getting the structure correct. Like, we actually have 5 levels of indentation, whereas, we assumed 3. And so things were getting out of order as a result. But once we fixed things like that, then to be honest, the way I did it was I ran PDFs of the old stuff and the new stuff. And then I divided each document up into their respective chapters. And then I ran the Adobe Acrobat compare tool against them. And I literally went through page by page. And that's an interesting question, because of all the people that I talked to, they said, hey, you really can't, if you just want to compare content, you can run a utility that will just pull out all the content and put it in the text file, but not sure how usable that is because you lose a lot of semantic context, right? And so it ended up being a human being using the Acrobat compare tool as a visual aid to see where the differences were, go through literally 2,000 pages at a time to make sure it conveyed over. And it gave me a lot of confidence because, like I said, we never lost anything in content. What we ended up finding the most were actual content errors in the source material, which was a good exercise.
Yeah, I was thinking back on that. Even things like a change in case, or if somebody had AOM versus OM, those are, from a programmatic standpoint, completely different. And if you program to attack one of those and deal with the issue, the nice thing was some of the reporting capabilities that exist in various tools. Just as an aside, DITA meant that in some cases, we could work with Oxygen. In some cases, we can work with FrameMaker. In some cases, we're working directly inside AEM, and it's DITA. So we're using the different tools in order to take advantage of the various strengths that they have. Somebody mentioned, by the way, in the chat, and I laughed at this one, Amanda writes, I dream of a day when I can get my SMEs to review content for accuracy and not complain about fonts. Or an engineer who has a tick about text hyphenating at a page or column margin and marking up an entire manual, asking me to remove those. And I think it was just really interesting how, at certain times you just had all right, so Pat Porter is going to go in and say the following. And if people don't like it, well, then I'll deal with that when it comes along. And I think that sort of takes us to the idea of where is the as we move along? What's coming up next in the world of Gulfstream? What are some of the other considerations that you have that are sort of top of mind right now in and around working with DITA, working with the AEM instance, working with the various outputs, the audiences, all of that?
That's a great question. I don't think anything that we're thinking of right now is cosmic, and I think a lot of the folks that are dialed into this symposium doing this every day are probably light years beyond where we are. I haven't had a chance to review or listen in on some of the presentations, but I plan to go back and view as many of them as I can because I'm looking for ideas. You know, there are tools out there are solutions out there that I think many of you have implemented that I would love to learn about. But in the aviation industry, again, we're kind of tied to this sort of paper mentality. Like even in our review processes, like our review processes are very paper-like. They want to see a PDF. They want to see a facsimile of what the printed product is going to look like to do their review. You know, we want to get out of that business and get into all electronic workflows. We want to get them into the mindset of, hey, you're approving the content. You're not approving the thing that gets printed. That's a paradigm shift. And one of the reasons we want to go there is not me, but my boss and his counterparts at his level across Gulfstream wants to lead the drive towards a purely paperless cockpit, right? And that's the nirvana, right? Every paperless, right? And as I said, even in the digital world, a lot of what we reproduce in the digital world are paper representations. But we truly want to go paperless and move all of our flight manual content onto the avionics. You know, interface with your flight manual content in the same place that you're interfacing with the aircraft. But there are regulatory barriers to get there in terms of data accuracy, data integrity, data accessibility, redundancy, things like that. I mean, if you looked at that flight deck picture that Bernard showed you, we have 4 main displays and we have 5 touchscreen controllers that basically are like mini iPads on steroids. And each of those displays, the main displays, are driven by, I think there's 3 graphics modules, you know, that run those. So there's redundancy. So we think from a computing architecture, power, and redundancy perspective that the reliability argument is there to move all of our flight manual content straight onto the avionics. But there's, like I said, there's regulatory impediments right now that we're looking to kind of be the lead in the aviation industry to try to go ahead and tackle and move beyond. So I'd say that's our biggest frontier that we're pushing towards right now. I'd say the other thing is one of the things my boss is very, very interested in as we move towards hopefully, you know, an iOS or Android based XML, HTML type of implementation for our content, at least on a tablet type devices, and then even web based, you know, when you're on the ground, is context sensitive search, which that's probably, you know, one of our next discussions is how do I use DITA to tag content if I'm in icing conditions. You know, I'm sitting at an airport and right now I've got icing limitations in my airplane flight manual and I've got operating procedures for de-icing and anti-icing. And then I've got, you know, a different section of that manual where I've got cold weather procedures. You know, he's looking for a context sensitive search where I just type in icing and it gives me a pop-up of, okay, here's the 6 references you need to review, you know, from start to finish about starting your airplane in cold weather and making sure that it's free of ice. And then, you know, if you got to go to the de-ice pad, here's your de-ice and anti-icing procedures. And you got to clear the engine during taxi of ice because you're taxiing in freezing fog. Here's the procedure for that. You know, rather than me having to go search for all of those individual pieces of content throughout the manual, you know, where we want to get to is I type in a keyword and I get what I need in one place. I don't know how to do that. If any of you guys out there know how to do that, please contact me at patrick.porter@gulfstream.com.
Perfect. And there were a couple of questions in the chat that I've tried to answer sort of inline. So I'll just give them a quick summary before we get to the wrap up here, just for some of the people who were looking. One was, do we do constraints in the elements that are in the DITA world? And we tried not to do a formal restraint, but more of an informal. So inside AEM, we have snippets so that people can come along and basically drag and drop combinations of predefined elements. So if there's a challenge and a response pairing that's required, we're not in a position where we have to tell a pilot, hey, you've got to remember that you've got to go in and create a task. And when you're creating a task, it has steps. After you create your step, and we don't have to go in and do the other approach where we say, hey, every single one of these things that we want to deal with, we're going to go in and give you this big sheet that says, when you insert this piece, here's the paragraph, and here's all of the different properties that have to be assigned to it. So there is a bit of a restriction, but it's not a formal constraint in the DITA model. Keys and conrefs are being used in a couple of different places. The question was, what about OT issues? And we resolved those by going through FrameMaker for the publishing. The concerns that were there that could have existed in the OT, we've already resolved. A couple of others in and around the permissions and the various specs. Somebody mentioned the interesting header design. It's not coming from AEM. The header that you saw in the PDF is something that we've incorporated in on a PDF side through FrameMaker. So when it does the publishing, it generates and builds the links that then allow a pilot to come through and react in some of the emergency environments that may come up, or at a tap, be able to quickly jump to what matters.
I want to make a comment on a couple of the questions. Do you constrain your elements? My goal is, I'd like the XML structure to be as simple as possible to do the job, so that the intent was to actually have pilots, for example, in there editing their content. And we have a few that are doing it. Some of it gets pretty complicated. So the intent was to keep it as simple as possible and only use what we need. And when we first started, it was fairly simple, but we've kind of had to grow in complexity. And a lot of the reasons why we've had to grow in complexity is to add attributes and values for attributes to make the publishing do what we want to. And that's been a bit of a frustration, because I'm like, hey, Bernard, how come I can't left align a paragraph? Because I have to do that in the EDD and FrameMaker. I'm like, why can't I put an attribute? You're like, there's sometimes where I'm like, you know what? I'm going back to Microsoft Word because I can do that. So we don't
have fun with that.
We don't. I know we don't look to constrain it deliberately, but try to keep it as simple as possible and add what we need. We may end up constraining some attribute values just to make it easier for the authors to just like click a drop down box and select the only valid choices we want them to have. The other one on key refs, I learned the hard way that DITA doesn't support the use of con key refs, particularly in the prologue area. So I had to go use a conventional con ref, but we are using key defs, con refs for cross-linking, hyperlinking. For example, we have to put revision dates, things like that. So whenever I do a revision, just a quick example, whenever we do a revision, we don't know what the revision date's going to be until it's actually signed and approved. When we revise a topic in the prologue, I have a con ref to a DITA file that just has a list of revision dates, and every one of those revision dates has a unique ID for that revision. So all I have to put in the prologue is a link to that DITA file, and in that DITA file I put date TBD, and then what happens is once we get the approval date, I put the approval date in that one location, that one DITA file. And on all the pages where it gets needs to be updated, it gets updated automatically. So that's just an example. And I'll shut up now because I think we're done, and I'm getting the look that it's time to wrap it up.
Well, I know you've got a meeting with a group of pilots, and you've got a meeting with your boss. So for anybody who is listening in, just as wrap up, I think we've covered a lot of Q&A. We got into some of the tech at the end here. Multiple outputs, multiple audiences, multiple documentation sets. If you happen to have your phone and you snap your camera at either of these QR codes, you can go in and get in touch with us. And I'll wrap by doing a quick thank you. Pat, thanks a lot. I'm really glad you were able to be here today, and you didn't, I hope, have to give up a flight window in order to be, flying along, approaching the speed of sound at 30,000 feet in luxury. So a thank you to you. Matt and Stefan, thank you so much for all the work that you guys are doing, the bloggers who are there behind the scenes, everybody who's attending the sessions, the Adobe TCS team, and again, a broad thank you to everybody who's been involved that I may not have mentioned from start to end. So with that, Stefan, I'll turn it back over to you, and we will mute on this end. I'll stay in case there's more questions that come up in the chat. And Pat, good luck at the meeting.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot from the Adobe team and Matt and myself. And I think also a big thank you from the audience.